Hello, welcome to another Brushes and Brews watercolor painting tutorial. Here is what we'll be creating today. It's a whale shark in a super simple underwater scene with some sun rays coming down. So there's a list of materials in the comments, but what you'll need today is masking tape, eraser, a light, so a HB or a B pencil, a few different brushes, two of around the same shape. So these are sixes. They're called round brushes. They got nice pointy ends when they're wet. And a bigger brush, you can use a mop brush if you've got it, but something a little bit larger. That's about a 12. If your brushes don't have numbers, just go, I don't know, the size of your ring finger and a little bit smaller than your pinky finger. Don't have to be too fussy. These brushes are not fancy, not too expensive. You'll need a black pen to sign your piece at the end, or however you like to sign it. A palette, some watercolor paints. I'm using a paint pan, but if you have paints in a tube, you can use those too. Just be sure to pre-mix them. You also need one teeny tiny brush to put those little white dots on at the very end, and those white dots we're using just normal white acrylic paint today. If you don't have acrylic paint, maybe go get some. If not, you can use gouache or gesso, depending on how you say it. You can also use toothpaste in a pinch. So if you've got that and you really want to paint right now, just get some of that toothpaste onto your palette. You make it work. One thing I didn't mention you'll need is some paper towel. So if you don't have that, go grab some now. This comes in really handy if you make any mistakes, and as well, we're going to be using it to create our sun rays. But we're going to start by taping our page to the table. That way we make a nice white border that you can see on the example for today, which I've signed my name in, and that also stops our paper from going really crinkly from the amount of water that we're going to be using today. So we're just going to rip off lengths of tape, and before we stick them to the page, we need to get rid of some of this aggressive stickiness. We do that by sticking it onto our clothes. So if this was your shirt or your jeans, just pop it on and lift it up a few times. So I'm just going to do that on my clothes. This ensures that when you go to remove your tape, you're not going to take any paper with you, because that, after all your hard work, can lead to a little bit of sadness. Now get your best nose picking finger, all of them, as some might say, go over those edges just to make sure they're nice and pressed down. We're going to tackle the most difficult part of this tutorial. You're wanting to use your HB pencil, but I'm using a black pen just so you can see what I'm drawing. So on your page, you're going to decide which way you want your whale to be facing. So we're going for this one from bottom left up to the top right, but get creative, follow your dreams, do whatever you want. So with your pencil, you're pressing very lightly. If you want to do a practice, feel free to do a practice to be more comfortable, but we're going to press super lightly with our pencil, and we're just going to draw a dot at the top and a dot at the bottom and put a line in between them. This will give us the general direction that our whale is going to go in. Now coming down just a little bit from there, we're going to pop another dot and then almost level with it, but back a little bit and slightly higher, we're placing another dot. Now this is for the basic shape of our whale. First, we're going to make a polygon whale. So we're just joining up these dots to create a real basic whale shape. Now I've gone a little bit skinny here, so I'm actually just going to bring that down a bit more, but that's okay, we can fix that later. So you can see a strange kite shape starting to form. That's okay, it'll turn into a whale. So we've got our middle line, our two dots that we're joining into triangles, and then about a third of the way along, I'm going to put a relatively large triangle poking up, and then putting a little bit of distance between that. I'm putting a smaller triangle there, and then around halfway from this top triangle, we're putting another smaller triangle coming down there for our fin on the bottom, and then starting a little bit back from here, we're putting a nice big but slanted triangle coming down from there. So you can see the basic shape of our whale starting to form. Now the tail happens with one big triangle and one smaller triangle. Now I haven't joined that there because my tail's a bit thin, but that's okay. So this whale is just made up basically of a bunch of triangles. And I'll run through this whole process again when I put this down on my page. So lots of triangles, little ones, big ones, but you know whales, they're not actually made of triangles. So now with our pencil, we're going to come back through and round off all of our edges really nicely, tracing just outside these lines. So remembering that this fin, it's okay to have a bit of a more harsh line there because it does come up like this. Then we're going to come down, put a nice curve in here, a nice curve in his little armpit, a curve over this fin, and then joining that up. Down here we have another curve into the tail, and then a nice curve here, another curve there, coming up to the top. Now this one isn't as curvy, but you still need a little bit of a curve. Bending back down, another curve there. So basically all of your really harsh lines, you just want to soften them a little bit, remembering to press really lightly with your pencil. So curving that out and bring that down to join. So this is the basic shape of our whale. We're going to move on to our final one. So we're going to put 3 nice big gills on here. Be careful with eyes. Often when you add a little eye, it can make it look quite juvenile. So all I'm adding in the eye department is sort of just a little curvy line. And then we do actually have 3 lines that go along here, but we won't pop them in yet. We can put those in once we've got some color on. So now that our basic shape is on here, I want you to come in and just erase that until you can barely see it, so that when we get to painting over it, none of our lead pencil is showing through at all. We've drawn on our basic whale shape. We're actually going to get straight into the background today. Now our background is a mixture of green, blue, and a darker blue, or even a blue-grey. Wash your brush off, make sure it's really nice and clean. And what we're going to do is cover the whole background with water. So we're getting nice and close into those lines with our water using a clean brush. So getting on there nice and fast, not putting it on too thick. Otherwise we can end up with paper that's really crinkly. Now we're starting with our green at the top, just going in a really rough sideways motion, laying that paint on, not too thin, not too thick, so it's still a little bit see-through, but just sort of slapping that in there. Now when we get to about 1/3 of the way down, we can introduce our blue, remembering to not be perfectly straight. Let this blue sort of travel up a little bit into the green, let the green travel down a little bit into the blue, just to create a sense of movement going on here and interchanging the colors of the water. So we're doing kind of the 2nd third of the background in this blue, remembering to be nice and careful around our edges. So what you can see has just happened here is I've gone over the tip of that tail. Now I don't really want that to happen, so I'm going to get a brush, clean it off with water, squeeze it between my fingertips and just touch that space where the paint has gone, and that brush will remove the paint that I've put on there. So I'm going to keep going, moving relatively fast to make sure that paint gets on, and then moving on to my third colour, which is darker, remembering it can travel up a little bit into the higher layers, but also reaching all the way down to the base of our painting. So working relatively quickly to get those colours in there. Remembering that, so I've left a bit of a patch here that might feel natural to fill with this dark blue, talking about here, but remembering it's more in the middle of the artwork. So I'm actually going to use this lighter blue to fill in under his little armpit, if whale sharks have armpits. So again, I've gone in too far, so I'm just going to remove some of that paint with a wet but clean brush. You can also use paper towel to remove little mistakes like that if you like. Now I'm just going to bring a tiny bit of green in these areas to add a little bit of interest. Blend that in nicely. Now here's where we need to work quickly, and there's two options. One is to put the sun rays in. You can wash your brush, clean it off in your hand, and then get that brush going upwards from the whale and just drag off bits of paint, cleaning in between as you do it, making sure to make all those sun rays not perfectly even. But I find that this next method is actually a lot easier. So we get our paper towel and we fold it into a point. We drag that paper towel up through the water to create those sun rays. Now we're starting from where our whale is because we need to remember the way that sun works. So when it comes down and it hits the whale, it stops where the whale shark, whatever you want to call it, is, and then doesn't actually continue beyond that because the whale is blocking the rest of the ocean from receiving that sun ray. So we're going to stop where it meets the whale shark, but then once we come down here we can see that it actually does continue because it's not stopped by the body of the whale shark. I'm going to add a few more sun rays here just to sort of make it not look so uniform, and then pop in a few coming off just the edges to create a little sense of light. Now this all looks quite uniform, so to mess it up a little bit, get a clean brush, dip it in your water, and just put a few taps of water onto your page occasionally, some up the top, some on the sides. It's quite nice down the bottom because the darker colours show up a little bit better, and this will cause your paint to bleed a little bit and leave you with these really nice effects that we have in here. It gives us a more natural sense in the water, and it sort of cuts up these sun rays that we've got. So I've popped all of that on. If there's bits that I'm not quite happy with in the sun rays, I can come back and blend them in, but make sure you're doing all of this while your painting is still wet. If you feel like you've put too much water in, again, use that technique with a clean, wet-ish brush to sort of remove some of that water, or you can get a piece of paper towel and just dab that paper towel on, but being careful not to remove too much of the colour as you go. So we've got our first layer on. The next layer is actually going to be our whale. So I'm going to grab my hairdryer, dry this off, and then we'll talk about layer 2. Righto, so now that that's dry, we can start on our first layer of the whale. Now the whale actually happens in 3 layers, whale shark. So we do a base layer, we put in these darker details, and then we use our white acrylic paint to put in the dots. So using our smaller brush, we are going to be putting in these details. mixing up some nice blues. So making sure we've got a nice variety of blues there. We've gone quite dark, but also we've got some that are a little bit lighter as well. So we're going to paint our whole whale shark in with a thin layer of water. Now we're going to start up top of our whale with a lighter colour, moving down to a dark. So grab your light colour and just pop it all along that top edge of your whale. Be mindful while you're mixing your blues to use some different blues that you use for the ocean, so you do get a bit of contrast between your whale and its background. So adding in those nice light blues carefully around the top, about half or a third of the way through your whale if we were to sort of cut it on that original line that we drew. Remembering it's okay if you have little white patches coming through, because that can represent a little bit of light or a different shade of colour on our whale. Now while we've got it like this, we're going to make sure that edge stays nice and wet, but really quickly grab a piece of paper towel, scrunch it up so you've got some uneven edges, and we're just going to tap that top layer of our whale just a little bit to remove some of that paint, and that gives us a little bit of a speckled sun ray kind of feeling. Now we're going to come back in, put a few dots of colour where we've taken it off, just to add a nice amount of interest in here, remembering that we're going to come back in later with some more definite detail. So just sort of spreading those out and using that paper towel to remove those really heavy colours. Now we're going to transition to our darker colours on the bottom of the whale shark, being mindful to be really careful of the edges, making sure they're nice and straight. Now if your blending isn't working really well, it just means that this top layer might have dried a bit. That's okay. All you need to do is wet your brush and just sort of come in and tickle that little edge there, and that will cause it to blend quite nicely. So coming down into here, to create that nice white edge, we're going to bring the dark down along this front end of the bottom fin, and then we're going to use what I call the watermelon technique, which is, if you've got a second brush, wet that with just plain water and make sure that's nice and damp along that edge in there, and then get your painted brush and just sort of tickle that little edge there to create a nice bleed happening between the edge of the fin and this darker colour here. Now I'm not too much of a fan of this really definite line, so I'm just going to add a little bit more water and a little bit more paint and just sort of mess this line up a little bit here before I move on to the rest of the whale. The rest of the whale for this first layer is quite simple. We're just filling in that darker colour on the bottom. Now as you come along here, you can see that my water layer from the beginning has dried. So again, with a wet brush, just going over that and sort of tapping those darker blues back in to create that blended effect. You can see some nice bleeding happening there. I'm going to bring in a little bit more darkness on this front edge and on the base up here of the head while it's still wet. Just tapping lightly with my brush to create a bleeding effect. Now I'm going to bring the dark colour down into this part of the fin, then grab my water brush and let that bleed up kind of naturally into there, adding a little bit more of that initial blue just to make that blend really nice and neat. Then I'm going to get my dark colour and just put it right underneath here to create that sense of shadow in our fin. So that's awfully blended as before. Just getting a brush that's a little bit wet, tickling that edge to create a bit more of a blend happening there. And then I'm going to come in with some plain water and just dot it occasionally like we did for our background to create some interesting shapes pretty much at random. So that's our first layer of the whale done. Second layer of detail coming up soon. Grab your hairdryer or your cup of tea, go for a walk. We'll dry this off and start on layer 2. Now we're going to go for our last little bits of detail. Now these really create the shape of the whale, so be super careful to make them happen. So I'm going to draw in lines with my lead pencil just to show where the detail's going, and then we'll paint it in. So we're going to put a line in here to show that join of the fin and the belly of the whale is different. I'm going to put a line in here to show that this fin is almost on the other side of the whale a little bit more. I'm going to put a little line in here and a similar line in there just to create some interest in these fins, and then a line coming through here to indicate a little bit more shadow on the tail of the shark. And we're going to pop in those 3 gills and a sort of tiny arc shape or a line for the eye, and then the big 3 bits of detail are 3 curvy lines. That's one. The first one starts almost at the base of that top fin, curves from there. The second one follows the same shape, just a little bit bigger. The third again follows that same shape, but up a little bit further. I've probably gone a little bit too far with all 3 of those, so I'm going to lightly rub them out. They go to about there. So we'll start with all of our outside lines. Now using a fine brush or just being careful with the tip of your brush and quite a dark colour. What you'll need definitely for this is a brush with colour on it and a brush with no colour on it. So this one is just our water brush. So the way it works is we're going to use our colour brush to paint in those more definite lines with a nice amount of colour, and then our water brush to put in a little layer or a line of water and then just tickle it to that edge to create a nice blend. Now we can clean off our brush with our finger, clean the water off, and just come in and fix up any mishaps that we might have. I'm actually going to put a bit of a darker line down the base here as well, just to make sure we've got a really nice definite line there. Because remember, our light's coming from the top and our shadow is on the base. So I've wet this brush a little bit. Just going to drag up along this line to create a bit of a softer edge there on that shadow. Pulling that back in, adding a little dab of water here and there to create some interest. So that's a nice amount of shadow there. We're going to do the same thing along here. So just drawing in that line, using our brush that just has water on it to add a thin line of water, and then join those 2 up with a little tapping or sweeping motion just to create a nice shadow with a lovely little blend. So again, popping that line in, I'm going to extend this line all the way down to here, and then working quite quickly with our water brush, just tapping those edges to make sure we've got a really nice blend. If your line dries before you get to it, just grab a bit of extra water, come back in and wet it nicely. Here again, I'm going to put some more water to create that more subtle blending line. So we're just repeating the same process over and over, putting in a thin line. And then here, we're going to blend this up and into the top fin, mostly to create that definition of the back of the whale. Now I've gone a bit too far and removed a bit too much paint, so I'm going to come in again with my blue there to add that back in and then blend it off nicely here. One last more little bit of detail along here. Just a lovely way of adding definition and shape to our final piece. Now I'm actually putting in a little bit more colour on the back side of these top fins because I lost them a little bit in between my background. So just using really tiny amounts of colour and a good solid amount of water. We're blending that in. Now the last lines are using the watermelon technique. That's not a technical term, that's just what I call it. So we're going to start by using our water brush and putting a thin line of water from the start to just beyond the end of that pencil line we've drawn in. Get a decent amount of paint on your brush, just using the tip of your brush, drag along that line. And you'll get a nice bleed happening all the way along. Now, if you don't like the way it's ended, use your water brush to spread it out a little bit. We're doing the same thing for the second line. So a thin line of water, making sure your first and second and third lines don't touch each other. Now with our coloured brush, coming in and just drawing along that top line. So we're making the lead pencil line disappear with our nice dark blue, while at the same time making sure our blend is nice and subtle. So I think I went a little bit too far there, so I'm just adding in a little bit more water and scraping that paint back a bit. Same thing here, getting rid of some of that colour so we can still see the background behind it. Now for the third line, same thing, a nice amount of water on your brush and just dragging that along. If it's too thick, it will bleed too fast, so if you do that, wipe your brush off with your finger, run it over that line. So the last step of this line, same as the other two, we're just running over that with our colour brush and then using this water brush to create a nice bleed coming down there. Now my lines have joined a little bit, so I'm wiping off my brush and just cleaning that up a little bit, but don't be too worried if they do join. This whale can be relatively interpretive. So the gills, we're not going to use a watermelon technique, we're just using our colour straight on because they're quite a definite line. So we're just painting straight over them, and then the little line for the eye. While I'm here, I'm going to add a little bit more definition just around the bottom edges of the whale shark. Your definition may already be just how you like it. If so, don't add anything more, but if you want to add a little bit more, just pop in a few more of those lines. So that is our second layer complete. The last layer is our white paint, but you need to make sure your watercolour paint is completely dry before you start that. So we're just going to dry that off now. Now for this last step, we're going to be using acrylic paint that we haven't mixed with any water or anything. It's just going on straight and quite thick. So if your paint sort of ends up sticking up a bit, I wouldn't worry too much about it. That's really helpful for this part if you have a reference image of a whale shark. I've got one just off to the side, but I can also use the one I've painted before. So as you can see, The dots aren't just polka dots all over. So they're quite large in the middle. They almost follow a linear shape. They're a little bit more sporadic on the tail. They're very close together on this fin and then really close together on the face. Get your really fine brush. We're just going to start down the bottom. Now, something I do find when you're putting dots in, it's really easy. So if I wanted to put dots, you know, in this shape and have them look random, it's really easy to just go around in that shape, but that looks a little bit too uniform. So if you are doing dots, especially in the fin and on the face, I just do them a little bit off kilter, almost one for one, and then add in a few extra random dots. Just see how this looks a little bit more sporadic rather than the uniformity of using a pattern. So I'd go left, right, left, right, left, right, and then chuck in a few more little random ones to make it a little bit more interesting. On the base were quite tiny little dots. I'm doing a left, right sort of pattern happening here. Not putting too many dots in this base of the tail. And then adding a few more at the top. And they sort of start to get a little bit more uniform as we come around to the body of the whale. Now these dots are a little bit bigger and I did them almost in lines, but sort of not perfectly straight. So as you can see, I'm sort of doing them in lines, but back a little bit. So slanted lines. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to start up here and pop them in, remembering not to make them perfectly uniform and in line. Make them a little bit more random, but not too random. So going a little bit off kilter here, but bringing them down, remembering these dots are the hefty ones and they're not too close together. They're quite small on the base of the whale and bigger on the top. Again, just bringing those down. Remembering to reload your brush quite often to make sure you're not getting scratchy dots like I did down here. But so they're quite full dots. Now just following that sort of pattern along, I'm putting a dot at the top. One in this first line, one in the second, one in the third, and then a couple of dots underneath it. We follow that all the way up, almost to the very top of his head. I feel like a play school teacher when I say that. Yeah, it was my dream as a child to be on play school. When I was a grown-up, I think it'd just be sick, getting paid to play with toys on TV. Wouldn't be half bad. So we're almost done with these more larger, uniformish dots. Now I'm going to add a few real babby ones down the bottom. I'm not putting any on that bottom fin, but chucking a few down in here. Now when we get closer to the head, the dots do get smaller, so I've got maybe 1 or 2 more layers of the big ones. Now here it gets quite interesting because these lines of dots continue on the top of the head, but then it's quite interesting, they sort of start to squeeze together as they get closer to the armpit of the whale. So just going to do one more layer of that to illustrate how they start wide out open and then they squeeze together. Now for the fin, I'm actually going to draw back in that nice white line because that is quite striking. So if your line was already quite white from your blending, good for you. If not, chuck in the paint here. And now we're going for really, really teeny tiny dots on the armpit side of the fin. And then we're starting to get a little bit bigger as we make it towards the front end of the whale. Remembering that we don't want them to be too randomly placed, but we don't want them to be too uniform either. So if you're doing a really giant whale, you could use a cotton tip for this, or a Q-tip as the Americans call them, or a toothpick if you don't have a really fine brush, but can just use the tip of one of your other brushes as well. So I've covered this in dots, but I don't like how uniform they are, so I'm just kind of come in and add a few more at random to sort of stir things up a little, put some small ones among the big ones. And now here at the head of the whale is where the dots get really, really close together. So we're going to use what I talked about at the beginning with this sort of left, right technique, but make sure the dots are still quite small and just cover the face of the whale in dots. Now, if these look too perfect, don't worry, because we're going to come back in and add some more randomly placed dots towards the end. Now we are going to put some in between the gills, remembering to use different shapes, different sizes of dots in between them, so it's not too perfect or overly organized. And we're going to make sure we've got a nice amount of dots down at the base, but you can make these a little bit smaller as though the light were obstructing them a little bit. So I'm just barely touching the paper with the paint that's on my brush. And then using these really small dots, come in and start filling in any spaces where you feel could do with a dot, or going over dots that you didn't do with enough depth. Now what we haven't done yet is these top fins. So they have got a few random dots on them, getting thinner as we get towards the back, smaller. So a few nice big ones, and then turning to smaller dots as we get closer to the back of that fin. Now, once you get to this point, you can be tempted to overdo it in the dot department. I think I've overdone it on this fin, but that's all right. So I would stop, take a good look, see how you feel about it. Maybe wash your brush, crack your knuckles, pat your dog. See how you're feeling about this. I'm just going to try and soften this edge a little bit so it's not sticking up quite so much. Grab your hairdryer. Dry these ones off. Tape removal, super easy. We're just peeling back. Go nice and slow to make sure that you're not taking any of your paper with you. So the final step is to make sure you sign your work, and then you're all finished. Thank you so much for joining us for a brushes and brews tutorial. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'd love to see what you created. So you can join our Facebook community of budding artists, or you can just put a comment below. It's been great.